Howdy y'all, it's Cody from the Keepers of Nerddom. How you doing? It's time to talk a little bit about Warhammer 40k. It is 10th edition coming up, and finally we've gotten some news on a thing that we had rumors about, some big changes. And the big changes are to the psychic phase. We also knew about the morale phase. We'll go through that real fast, because I think that's an interesting part of it. Morale phase, it's gone, and it's just part of like the very end of your turn stuff. And you check if you're under half strength, you have to roll against your leadership. If you pass, you're all good. If you fail, instead of losing models, you actually have to, and this is interesting, like you go down to 0 objective control. You might have something with losing models on if you're trying to get out of close combat or something, or you've had to flee. I don't know. That was a weird thing, but from what I could tell, there was no actual loss of models on anything but a specific section of like you're trying to get out of close combat, and you can't use stratagems on that force if they failed their morale test during the next till the next command phase. So kind of an interesting thing that you can't buff them. Pretty cool, pretty interesting, that we won't lose models anymore. And so you're not going to have a group of Necron warriors that happen to fail a leadership test because they lost 7 or 8. And yeah, like this is exciting. Then the other thing that's so fascinating, I'm not sure exactly what I think on it yet. There's part of me that's really excited, and you'll have to look up some extra pictures, but I'll put a picture up here as the thumbnail for this video, or at least the big picture for this video. Is this psychic phase is now put into other phases, or it's just buffs that go straight onto the unit your leaders are now going to be a part of, because now our leaders are going to just be absorbed into things for the most part. There's going to be some exceptions, bigger things like Silent King or maybe Trajan Valorous, stuff like that. But this is fascinating stuff, because it really changes things. And then psychic powers, we had 2 previews today apparently of a Space Marine, the Librarian, and then the Weird Boy for the Orcs. And the Space Marine Librarian had 2 different versions of its Psychic Smite and some other psychic stuff over on the side that just buffed the group he was a part of, kind of deals, which was cool. Those are fun, and it's just like, all right, boom, done, simple, we're over. But his psychic abilities are now a psychic power that activates and shoots like the weaponry in the shooting phase, the firing phase. And it just takes the psychic phase out of it. It's gone, and it's just a piece that's now built into something else. This is fascinating. This is, part of me is like, this is really exciting, and I'm just kind of cautious though too, because I want to go, what are the ramifications? Because so the things I notice on this is that it's almost treated like a bolter or another firearm in the game, which is cool, but it also changes everything, because now there's not like, you just roll 2d6s, and as long as you go above the warp charge for your psychic power, you get to use it. There's also not necessarily psychic deny the witch tests here. Kind of weird, kind of bizarre, kind of interesting, but we don't know that for sure to see. We got to see. How to really explain just that the profile we saw first off was like, you roll a d6 to see how many shots you make with it. So these things are very, very random on the psychic stuff, which I think is really fascinating. That now all of a sudden, an entire squad will have a psychic power that could go 1 to 6 from a librarian, and then it has an actual ballistic skill associated with it, which I believe was 3+, and a strength, and I think the lower tier was 4 up, or 4 strength, and then the upper was 5 strength. And then it has like damage on it as well, and I think it was just it was D3 of damage, right? So these mortal wounds are gone in a way. As far as we can tell, there's no mortal wounds associated with this now, and you just take damage, but it could be more damage. This is interesting because you have saves that can go against it, and there was like AP, it was -2 or -3 I think, and then at a higher profile where you could suffer potential issues from the warp, but you could take that and suffer just a decision, which I think is really fun. That you could go for this higher thing that has more AP, more strength, still the same damage on him. And that was fascinating. This is the fascinating stuff. Like, this could be really, really good for the game, or really dangerous, just depending on how they balance it, right? That's always the challenge with Warhammer 40k. If they balance it correctly. If they don't, we're in trouble, right? Man, I'm excited to see for one of my friends that I play with their Grey Knights, what that's going to look like. Votan, I don't know what that will really change, because they have one psychic unit, so will he get absorbed into something else? I don't know. And I play Necrons, so we've not had a psychic phase, so it's not a thing that's mattered for us, but it's cool to see it rolled into the weaponry, and it's going to happen during the shooting phase, so it's just built in here, nothing crazy there. Like, it's actually so much more simple. I'm intrigued to see the extra little details, because there are some flavor things on them as far as different little abilities that they can gain depending on what Games Workshop puts on them, which is interesting. So the other thing that they previewed was a Weird Boy, and it had a psychic power called Edbanger, so like a headbanger, and it only hit on like a ballistic skill of 4+, so 50-50 shot, one attack. And I think the Weird Boy does have to go into a squad. Yeah, it does, because over on the far right of its chart, it had this ability. It's like for every 5, and you round down, so you have to at least have 5 to get any of these benefits. You get like +1 strength and +1, I believe, damage. And so for every 5, so 5, 10, 15, 20 of orcs that are with him, it increases his boost on his ability. And I don't know if they can go over 20 or not. I have no idea with them. They might be able to go to 30 or 40, which would be terrifying, right? It's not going to hit very often, but when it does, it's going to hurt really bad. This is cool. This is fascinating. But it does say that if it goes over 10 models that are boosting him, then he does get hazardous stuff where he can hurt himself with it, because it's really strong. So he's essentially like getting boosted off of the other units that are with him and trying to fight with him, and he's using their brain power to up his psychic ability. This is fascinating stuff. The only thing that I'm concerned about overall is the other change, really, of these leader units being thrown into other squads. They're going to be really hard to get rid of, just because your opponent's going to take everything else first. You know, especially like the librarian. That librarian is dangerous as all get out with his psychic power. So who's going to be lost last? I mean, it's going to be the librarian. And that makes sense. Now, granted, we've already had units like hero characters, named characters, that have been protected, at least from range, with the Lookout Sir rule. So that's already been present there, but you could charge them and defeat them in close combat. Now, you charge them, they're part of a squad, and your opponent gets to choose what actually gets destroyed. And so this is a side piece to this whole psychic thing. Like, I'm fascinated by the change to the psychic, but it's also going to mean that it's much harder to get rid of these psychers. Now, for example, Grey Knights may not really matter, considering they're all psychers, and I'll be intrigued to see what that does for them as far as their abilities, because it's going to look like they just have a huge amount of weaponry in the shooting phase, because essentially they will. Will they have a lot of people that can just roll into other squads? That will be intriguing, because that could actually cut down for them on their psychic powers, because that person is losing some of their stuff, or they both get their psychic powers. So the rest of the squad for Grey Knights gets their psychic stuff on top of the librarian or whatever they've got that can roll into this other this unit. I am so intrigued by this. This is fascinating. And so it's like my bigger concern isn't necessarily how psychic stuff has changed. I'm excitingly intrigued by it. It's more just that now those psychers can be so well protected behind other things, because they can jump into a unit in force prep, which then causes them to be the last unit ever taken. But now, granted, it's not guaranteed mortal wounds, but it just felt like it was so heavily slanted towards a psyker to give out mortal wounds. Like, as a Necron player, if nothing else has changed in this, I am so excited. Unless they say some little rule thing in the new Necron Codex and go, if it's a psychic ability, you don't get to just reanimate from it. They could totally do that. Because the reason we didn't get to reanimate from psychic stuff wasn't because it was mortal wounds. It was just because we reanimated in the shooting and the fight phase. That if we took damage in those phases, then we could reanimate. So if they keep that and just let it go like this, that gives, like, for example, Necrons quite a different layer of protection, because their save may not work, but the reanimations could still go off, and that will be interesting. Now, the one question I'll have, though, is a squad that is now shooting, because you don't get your reanimation until a unit finishes firing at you. Now, does that mean that they get to fire their psychic and their weapons before I get to reanimate? Therein lies another potential weakness, actually. Because if they get to fire all of it, which they may very well, then actually I lose my advantage, because that's more weaponry coming in at the same time before I get to roll. Because that could delete 20 warriors. Interesting. Very, very interesting. I'm intrigued. Right? I'm intrigued. This is both really, really good and really dangerous all at the same time. It just depends on how they design the rest of it. Like 40K, I'm so pumped for this stuff, because this will simplify some things. It will make some things go smoother. The challenge is it's just going to be more difficult in certain respects if you're not careful in how you design things. That there could be an imbalance randomly where a psychic force, such as Grey Knight, such as Eldari, Thousand Sons, I think, could really go running rampant if they get to have so much more in that shooting phase. You wouldn't think that would impact a whole lot, but at least for Necrons it does. Yeah, just an interesting thing. Like, it just could have some interesting impact. We haven't seen stratagems necessarily, very many. So that will have another impact on it. Like, the stratagems that we gain, will those actually interact and interfere with some of these psychic power stuff? I don't know, because now they're a part of the shooting phase. This is fascinating stuff. Let me know down in the comments below. Are you excited for 10th? Did you see this stuff? Like, what's your thoughts on the psychic and morale stuff, the changes therein? Because we've had a phase that is now, morale's gone, psychic's gone. These are phases that are gone, but they've been brought into other parts of the game, so they're still there. They just don't have their own little phase. So, for me, as a Necron player, I'm super excited that I could have some reanimations against these things, but I'm also a bit nervous because then, I guess I didn't get to reanimate from the original shots. So, I guess it really doesn't actually impact me. It just gives me a chance to reanimate from all of those. But there's more shots coming in, because they're not mortal wounds. Or is there? Because I think this smite was a D3 of damage. This is getting weird. This is getting exciting. I'm intrigued, right? I've been Cody from the Keepers of Nerddom. Like and subscribe, and give me your thoughts down in the comments below. Bye, y'all.